I promised pilgrimage, far-flung places, Italy, but let's stop, our first stop on our pilgrimage, somewhere proximate. This is our beautiful Church of St. Dominic's, and the Holy Father has said that anyone who comes into a Dominican church from July of 2023 all the way through January 28th of 2025 and prays in front of a statue or another devotional to St. Thomas Aquinas, praying the usual prayers for indulgence, will receive a full indulgence, a plenary indulgence. Now, we at St. Dominic's have our holy door. The Holy Father granted that to us particularly, so we've emphasized that. But for the sake of illuminating our mind and heart and knowing that we have actually a double blessing here, let's see if we can go into the church and find a place of St. Thomas Aquinas in order to have a moment of prayer. Follow me. And here we find it. We are in the north apse of the church, the cruciform section, and here we have a beautiful altar dedicated to St. Thomas Aquinas. And various aspects of his life are literally carved into wood here in this place. When we think of Thomas Aquinas, there are so many things that perhaps don't seem to naturally fit together and yet found a sense of synthesis in his life. Thomas was a priest, but also part of this new mendicant order of beggars, the Dominicans. He was a theologian par excellence, thinking about the great truths of God, and yet rooted in this new philosophy that came from the Greeks, a philosophy that was thought to be a bit suspicious, and in fact, in places condemned very virulently. He was a man of incisive speech, a very articulate, and yet he was a poet at the same time, writing some of the most beautiful poetry that we continue to sing in the heart of the church, particularly around the Eucharist. And so all the great Eucharistic devotions. Here in our altar we see St. Thomas Aquinas, surrounded by angels, known as the Angelic Doctor. And in his hand is the great Summa Theologiae, that great summary of theology in which he starts from the very beginning question of, does God exist? And goes all the way through to the sacramental life. Not only do we know God exists, but by the end of the Summa, or at least the part that he wrote, what do we have? Our encounter with that living God in the sacraments, particularly the Eucharist. You will see, and a little hard to see, but just behind that book is the great sunburst of St. Thomas Aquinas, signifying the Eucharist, the great Eucharistic miracle of Orvieto. And I'll be there in just a little over a week, and I'd love to bring you footage of my visit there, and I'll say a little bit more about the Eucharist when we get there. Here, though, to recognize we have the great theology of Thomas, but what stands behind it? The great love of the Eucharist. In other words, the living presence of God in Thomas's heart is what gave birth to his great theologizing, his great ability to understand who God is. And we see him at study underneath, and we also see him surrounded by angels. And he is known as the Angelic Doctor for two reasons. One reason, because he wrote so beautifully about angels. In fact, in my own theological work, I was very much drawn to his writing on the angels. Why? Because his insight into the world of reality that goes beyond taste and touch, beyond the matter we can see or feel. There is a reality that is purely spiritual, but is not necessarily good. There's a great battle, as St. Paul says, principalities and powers, a great war or battle or strife, strictly in the spiritual realm. And Thomas does a beautiful job of articulating what it is to be an angel, what it is to be a demon, how a spiritual substance can both what? Cling to God and seek God as its highest end, or fall away from God. And in a way, it's a lesson for us. There are certainly human ways that we fail. There are human ways that we succeed. But knowing particularly how angels do it gives us further insight to our own humanity. And Thomas in a sense, breaks open that kind of connection between metaphysical reality and, at the same time, great love of God and our ultimate destiny in heaven, having grown in virtue. Thomas, also known as the Angelic Doctor, because why? Because at a certain point in his life when he was about to join the Dominicans, his family was not excited about it. In fact, I'm going to visit and show you places where indeed he was kidnapped and in a kind of almost fairy tale scenario was locked in the top of a castle or a great column, and there he spent his time productively. Sequestered from the world, he memorized the scriptures. Sequestered from the world, he prayed with intensity that gave birth to a robust prayer life. And in the midst of this great exile, if you will, his family, particularly his brothers, send a temptress, someone to tempt him in the virtue of purity. And as the woman enters into the little cell, that little place of living he has with his little fireplace to keep warm on those cold Italian nights, he takes a brand from the fire, right out of the fire, and he chases her out of the room, chasing temptation away. And as he shuts the door, he brands or puts that fiery poker into the door, scalding it, and if you will, making a mark that would, in a sense, seal his heart and soul for God alone. Never again was he tempted. As the great story says, that evening, angels descended from heaven and girt him with a cincture that protected his purity, his mind and heart from any temptation going forward. Thus the Angelic Doctor, that one who was able to have insight to God because he was able to face temptations of the flesh, lust, and by chasing it off, by, in a sense, taking up the fire of God's love, banished that from his life and was given a special grace. Aquinas then, a man, a Renaissance man before his time. And I invite you now, as we make this moment here a moment of instruction around his altar, but invite you to prayer. If you come and pray here in the church, praying for our Holy Father's intentions, reciting a creed and the Lord's Prayer, a Hail Mary with the intention of asking St. Thomas Aquinas for your intercession, you can gain a plenary indulgence all the way up until January 28, 2025. I now invite you to join me as we will circle the world of pilgrimage to Italy and places around to follow in the life and the legacy of our holy St. Thomas Aquinas, Angelic Doctor.